A sterile millionaire disguised himself as a beggar to find someone to leave his inheritance to. Joseph stared at his reflection in the doctor's office window, a vision he barely recognized. His once immaculate salt and pepper hair now fell in disarray over a forehead marked by deep worry lines. The tailored suit that had been his armor in the boardroom now hung loosely on his frame, a testament to the toll his illness had taken. He had always been a shrewd businessman, but now, faced with his own mortality, everything seemed insignificant. The doctor, a longtime friend and confidant, looked at the test results with a visibly concerned expression. "Joseph, I need to be frank with you," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of the news he was about to deliver. "Without treatment, you have only a few months to live. Even with it, the chance of recovery is small, almost non-existent, but it is a chance." Joseph nodded, his mind already made up. "Doctor," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Living a few more months or even years without purpose is like being dead already. I don't have time for treatment. I need to find someone who will make sense of everything I will leave behind." The doctor's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "Joseph, you need treatment. You can't worry about an inheritance when you have a chance at life. Do you have no heirs? And you can't have children, as your tests have shown for years. You should focus on taking care of your health. Forget about your inheritance and take care of yourself." But Joseph barely listened. His mind was racing, filled with thoughts of his empire, his legacy, and the emptiness that had plagued him for years. "How can I think about myself and leave this world without ensuring my legacy endures?" he asked, more to himself than to the doctor. "I'm sterile, I have no family and no one who cares. This is my chance to do something with what I've built." The doctor persisted, his voice tinged with frustration and concern. "Joseph, you need to think about your health first. Without it, there is no legacy to be left." But Joseph's determination was unwavering. "What is a legacy without someone to receive it?" he countered. "I need to find a worthy heir, someone who understands the true value of all this." As he left the office, Joseph's mind was made up. He would find someone worthy of his inheritance, someone who could carry on his name and make a difference in the world. But how? The answer came to him as he watched a homeless man on the street corner, ignored by the bustling crowd. Maybe among those who have little or almost nothing. "I will find someone who values everything I have built," he thought. The idea took root, growing stronger with each passing moment. He would disguise himself as a beggar, living among those society had forgotten. It was a radical plan, one that went against everything he had known in his life of luxury and power. But as he felt the weakness in his body, the constant reminder of his limited time, Joseph knew it was his only choice. With a mix of fear and excitement, Joseph returned to his mansion, his mind already planning his transformation. As he looked in the mirror one last time before embarking on its journey, he murmured to himself, "If this is my last act, let it be meaningful." Little did Joseph know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge his beliefs, test his resolve, and ultimately redefine the meaning of family and legacy in ways he could never have imagined. Joseph's transformation from a millionaire to a beggar was meticulous and calculated. He stood in front of the full-length mirror in his opulent bathroom, carefully applying dirt to his face and hands. The expensive suit was replaced with tattered clothes he had sourced from a second-hand store. His perfectly coiffed hair was now a tangled mess, and he had grown out his beard for weeks to complete the illusion. As he studied his reflection, Joseph barely recognized himself. The man staring back at him looked weathered, desperate, and utterly forgettable, exactly what he needed to blend in with the city's homeless population. And a mix of excitement and trepidation coursed through his veins. This was so far removed from his usual world of board meetings and luxury that it felt almost surreal. "This is it," he muttered to himself, his voice gruff from lack of use. "Time to find someone worthy of everything I've built." Before leaving his mansion, Joseph made arrangements with his most trusted lawyer. He left instructions that if he didn't return within 6 months, all his assets were to be liquidated and donated to various charities. It was a failsafe, ensuring that even if his plan didn't work, his wealth would still do some good in the world. As he stepped out onto the street, the cool night air hit him, carrying with it the myriad smells of the city, a far cry from the sanitized environment he was used to. Joseph took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had researched the areas where the homeless congregated and made his way there, his gait purposefully unsteady to complete his disguise. The first few nights were a shock to Joseph's system. The hard concrete beneath him as he tried to sleep, the constant noise of the city, and the gnawing hunger in his stomach were all new experiences. He watched as people passed by, their eyes sliding over him as if he were invisible. It was a harsh lesson in how the other half lived, and Joseph found himself re-evaluating many of his long-held beliefs about poverty and social inequality. As days turned into weeks, Joseph began to settle into his new role. He learned the unspoken rules of street life, where to find food which shelters were safest, and how to avoid trouble with both the authorities and other homeless individuals. He engaged in conversations with his fellow street dwellers, listening to their stories of hardship, bad luck, and sometimes hope. Throughout it all, Joseph kept his eyes open for someone who might be worthy of his legacy. He wasn't just looking for someone in need, he wanted someone with integrity, compassion, and the drive to make a difference. But as time passed, he found himself growing increasingly discouraged. One particularly cold night, as Joseph huddled in a doorway trying to escape the biting wind, he overheard a conversation between two young men. "Hey, check out that old guy," one of them said, nodding towards Joseph. "Bet he's got some cash on him. These bums always stash away something." The other man hesitated. "I don't know, man. He looks pretty rough. Maybe we should leave him alone." "Don't be a wuss," the first one insisted. "It's not like anyone's going to miss him if something happens." As they approached, Joseph felt a mixture of fear and resignation. Was this how it would end? Beaten or killed in a dirty alley, with no one knowing his true identity? But before the men could reach him, a voice called out from the darkness, "Leave him alone." "Us!" A figure emerged from the shadows, a young man, probably in his early 20s, with determination etched on his face. He positioned himself between Joseph and the would-be attackers. "Back off," the young man said, his voice steady despite being outnumbered. "He's not worth your trouble, and I've already called the cops." The two assailants exchanged glances before melting back into the night, muttering curses as they went. The young man turned to Joseph, concern evident in his eyes. "Are you okay, sir?" he asked, offering a hand to help Joseph up. As Joseph took the offered hand, he felt a spark of hope. Could this be the person he had been searching for? Someone willing to put themselves at risk to help a stranger. "Thank you," Joseph said, his voice rough with emotion. "You didn't have to do that." The young man shrugged. "Everyone deserves help sometimes. I'm Aiden, by the way." "Joseph," he replied, using his real name for the first time in weeks. "I'm grateful for what you did, Aiden." As they talked, Joseph felt a growing connection to the young man. Aiden spoke of his struggles, his dreams of going to college, and his volunteer work at a local shelter. With each word, Joseph became more convinced that he had found someone worthy of his legacy. Little did Joseph know that this encounter would lead to revelations that would shake the very foundations of his world and challenge everything he thought he knew about family, legacy, and the true meaning of wealth. As Joseph and Aiden continued their conversation, the older man felt an inexplicable connection to the young Good Samaritan. There was something familiar about Aiden's features, the way he spoke, and even his mannerisms that Joseph couldn't quite place. "So, Aiden," Joseph began, his curiosity piqued. "What brings you out here at this hour?" Aiden shrugged, a wry smile playing on his lips. "I volunteer at the shelter down the street. Sometimes, after my shift, I walk around the area to see if anyone needs help getting to the shelter or just needs someone to talk to." Joseph nodded, impressed by the young man's dedication. "That's very noble of you. Not many people your age would spend their free time helping strangers." "Well," Aiden replied, his eyes clouding over with a hint of sadness, "I know what it's like to feel alone and in need of help. My mom raised me by herself, and we've had our share of tough times." As Aidan spoke about his mother and their struggles, Joseph felt a strange tug at his heart. He found himself wanting to know more about this young man's life, his hopes and his dreams. "What about your father?" Joseph asked, trying to keep his tone casual. And Aidan's expression hardened slightly. "Never knew him. Mom doesn't talk about him much. All I know is that he left before I was born." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Joseph felt a mix of emotions: sympathy for Aidan's situation, anger at the absent father, and a nagging feeling that there was more to this story. Suddenly, Aidan's phone buzzed. He checked it and his eyes widened. "Oh man, I totally lost track of time. I've got to get home. Mom's probably worried sick." As Aidan stood to leave, Joseph felt an overwhelming urge to maintain contact with this intriguing young man. "Aidan, wait," he called out. I'd like to repay you for your kindness. Is there any way we could meet again?" Aidan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, I guess. I'll be at the shelter tomorrow evening if you want to stop by." With that, Aidan disappeared into the night, leaving Joseph with a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Sir." The next evening, Joseph made his way to the shelter, his heart pounding with anticipation. He found Aidan sorting through donated clothes, his face lighting up with recognition as Joseph approached. Over the next few weeks, Joseph and Aidan fell into a routine of meeting after Aidan's volunteer shifts, and they would walk around the neighborhood talking about life, dreams, and the state of the world. Joseph found himself increasingly drawn to Aidan's compassion, intelligence, and determination to make a difference. One evening, as they sat on a park bench sharing a humble meal of sandwiches, Aidan turned to Joseph with a serious expression. "You know, Joseph," he began, his voice hesitant, "I've been meaning to ask you something. You're different from the other guys on the street. The way you talk, the things you know. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to your story." Joseph felt his heart race. He had grown to care for Aidan, and the thought of lying to him was becoming increasingly difficult. But before he could formulate a response, Aidan continued. "It's just you remind me of someone. I have this old photo of my mom when she was younger, standing next to a man. She never told me who he was, but I always thought it might be my father. And you look so much like him." The world seemed to stop for Joseph. His mind raced back to his younger days, to a relationship he had almost forgotten. Could it be possible? Possible. With trembling hands, Joseph reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, the one item from his old life he had kept with him. From it, he extracted a small, worn photograph. It showed a much younger version of himself standing next to a beautiful young woman. Aidan's eyes widened in shock. That's my mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The revelation hit them both like a tidal wave. Joseph felt a mix of emotions wash over him: joy at finding a son he never knew he had, guilt for not being there, and fear of rejection. "Aidan," Joseph began, his voice choked with emotion, I think I'm your father." Aidan stood up abruptly, his face a mask of confusion and anger. "No," he said, shaking his head vehemently. "No, that's not possible. My father left us. He didn't care about us." Joseph rose as well, reaching out to Aidan but stopping short of touching him. "I didn't know," he pleaded. "I swear I didn't know about you. If I had." Aidan was already backing away, his eyes filled with hurt and betrayal. "Stay away from me," he spat out before turning and running off into the night. Joseph stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling as if his world had been turned upside down. He had come looking for an heir and found a son, but instead of joy, he felt an overwhelming sense of loss and regret. And as he made his way back to his sleeping spot, Joseph's mind was in turmoil. He had always believed he was sterile, incapable of having children. How could this have happened? And more importantly, what was he going to do now? The next morning, Joseph made a decision. It was time to end his charade. He needed to reclaim his identity, find out the truth about Aidan, and make things right if he could. With a heavy heart but a determined spirit, Joseph began the journey back to his old life. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with explanations, apologies, and possibly more rejection. But for the first time in years, he felt a spark of real purpose. As he walked towards his mansion, Joseph realized that his search for an heir had led him to something far more valuable, a chance at fatherhood redemption, and a family he never knew he had. The question now was, would Aidan and his mother give him the chance? Joseph stood at the entrance of his mansion, feeling like a stranger in his own home. He had shed his beggar's disguise, showered, and donned one of his expensive suits, but the man in the mirror was not the same person who had left weeks ago. With a deep breath, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he had committed to memory during his conversations with Aidan. After a few rings, a woman's voice answered. "Hello." Joseph's heart raced. "Lillian? It's Joseph?" "It's Joseph." There was a long pause on the other end. When Lillian finally spoke, her voice was a mix of shock and disbelief. "Joseph, why are you calling after all these years?" "Lillian, we need to talk. It's about Aidan," Joseph said, his voice filled with urgency. With another pause, this time shorter, "Come to the cafe on 5th and Main, 1 hour." The line went dead. An hour later, Joseph found himself sitting across from Lillian in a small, quiet cafe. She looked older than he remembered, but still beautiful, with the same fierce determination in her eyes that had attracted him years ago. "You look well," Lillian, Joseph began, trying to break the ice. Lillian's eyes narrowed. "Cut the small talk, Joseph. How do you know about Aidan?" Joseph took a deep breath and began to recount his story, his illness, his decision to find an heir, and his unexpected encounter with Aidan. As he spoke, he watched Lillian's expression change from skepticism to shock to something akin to resignation. When he finished, Lillian sat back in her chair, her coffee untouched and cold. "I can't believe this," she murmured, "after all these years." "Lillian," Joseph leaned forward, his voice urgent, "why didn't you tell me about Aidan? I had a right to know I had a son." Anger flashed in Lillian's eyes. "A right? You disappeared, Joseph. Weeks after we broke up, I found out I was pregnant. I tried to contact you, but you had moved, changed your number. It was like you had vanished off the face of the earth." Joseph felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He remembered that time he had thrown himself into his work, cutting off all connections to his past in an attempt to forget the pain of their breakup. And then Lillian continued, her voice bitter. "I heard about your condition. How you were sterile, unable to have children. I thought you had known all along and that's why you left." Joseph shook his head vehemently. "No, Lillian, I swear I didn't know. The doctors, they told me years later that I couldn't have children. I never connected it to our time together." Lillian's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by a weary sadness. "It doesn't matter now, does it? Aidan grew up without a father. I did my best, but—" "He's an amazing young man," Joseph interjected softly. "You did a wonderful job, Lillian." A small smile played on Lillian's lips. "He is, isn't he? Despite everything, he's grown into someone I'm incredibly proud of." They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in thoughts of the past and the unexpected turn their lives had taken. Finally, Joseph spoke up. "Lillian, I want to make this right. I want to be part of Aidan's life, if he'll let me. And I want to help. Both of you." Lillian's eyes hardened. "We don't need your money, Joseph. We've managed just fine without it for 23 years. "It's not about money," Joseph insisted. "It's about family. About making up for lost time. Please, Lillian, give me a chance." As they continued to talk, delving deeper into the past and cautiously exploring the possibility of a future, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from across the street. Aidan stood frozen, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed, his mother sitting with the man he now knew to be his father. Back at Lillian's modest apartment, the atmosphere was tense. Aidan paced the small living room, his emotions a turbulent mix of anger, confusion, and a reluctant curiosity. "Why didn't you ever tell me about him?" Aidan demanded, his voice cracking slightly. Lillian sighed, looking years older than she had just hours ago. I thought I was protecting you, Aiden. I didn't want you to feel abandoned or unwanted. So you lied to me instead." Aiden's voice was bitter. "I never lied," Lillian countered. "I just didn't tell you everything. I'm sorry, Aiden. I thought I was doing what was best for you." Joseph, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Aiden, please don't blame your mother. If anyone's at fault here, it's me. I should have tried harder to stay in touch with Lillian. I should have known." Aiden turned to Joseph, his eyes blazing. "You're right, you should have. Do you have any idea what it was like growing up without a father? Watching other kids with their dads, always wondering why mine didn't want me." Joseph felt each word like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, Aiden. I know those words aren't enough, but I am truly deeply sorry. If I had known about you, I would have been there. I would have moved heaven and earth to be part of your life." The sincerity in Joseph's voice seemed to take some of the fight out of Aiden. He slumped onto the couch, suddenly looking very young and vulnerable. "I don't know what to do with all this," Aiden admitted quietly. "For years, I imagined meeting my father, but now that it's happened, I don't know how to feel." Lillian moved to sit beside her son, putting an arm around his shoulders. "You don't have to decide anything right now, sweetheart. We can take this one day at a time." Joseph nodded in agreement. "Aiden, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but if you're willing, I'd like the chance to get to know you, to be part of your life, in whatever way you're comfortable with." Aiden was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting Joseph's. "Well, I can't promise anything," he said slowly, "but I guess we could try, maybe start with dinner or something." Joseph felt a surge of hope. It was a small step, but it was more than he had dared to hope for. "Dinner sounds perfect," he said, a smile breaking across his face. As the three of them sat there, tentatively planning their first family dinner, Joseph realized that his search for an heir had led him to something far more precious, a chance to rebuild the family he never knew he had. But even as hope bloomed in his heart, a nagging worry persisted. His illness was still a ticking clock, and he had yet to tell Lillian and Aiden about it. How would this newfound family cope with the possibility of losing him so soon after finding him? And what other surprises did the future hold for this fragile, newly formed family unit? As the weeks passed, Joseph, Lillian, and Aiden cautiously navigated their new family dynamic. Regular dinners became a fixture, filled with conversations that ranged from awkward to heartwarming. Joseph found himself marveling at every new detail he learned about his son, from his favorite books to his passionate advocacy for homeless youth. One evening, as they finished a meal at Joseph's mansion, Aiden broached a subject that had been weighing on his mind. "So, I've been thinking," he began hesitantly, "about getting tested for that hereditary heart condition you mentioned, Joseph." Joseph felt a chill run down his spine. He had shared his medical history with Aiden, hoping to prepare him for any potential genetic issues, but the reality of it now felt overwhelming. Lillian reached out and squeezed Aiden's hand. "Are you sure, honey? It's a big step." Aiden nodded firmly. "I need to know, and if there is something wrong, it's better to catch it early, right?" Joseph agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course, I'll arrange for the best specialist to see you." The following week, Joseph accompanied Aiden to a top cardiology center. As they sat in the waiting room, Joseph couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and fear, pride in Aiden's bravery and fear of what the tests might reveal. Hours later, they sat in the doctor's office, waiting for the results. The tension was palpable as Dr. Chen entered, her face grave. "And I'm afraid I have some concerning news," she began. "Aiden, you have a rare genetic heart condition. It's not immediately life-threatening, but it will require careful monitoring and potentially significant treatment in the future." Aiden sat in stunned silence, while Joseph felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. This was his fault. His genes had cursed his son. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued, her brow furrowed. "In reviewing your family history, Mr. Millbrook, I noticed something unusual. This condition is typically passed down through both parents. It's extremely rare for it to manifest when only one parent carries the gene." Joseph and Aiden exchanged confused glances. "What are you saying, Doctor?" Joseph asked. I'm saying that statistically it's highly unlikely that Aiden would have this condition unless both you and his mother carried the gene. And given the rarity of this condition, Dr. Chen trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. The drive home was silent, both men lost in their thoughts. As they entered the mansion, they found Lillian waiting anxiously. "What happened? What did the doctors say?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. Joseph gently explained the situation, watching as Lillian's face paled with each word. When he finished, Lillian sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "Lillian," Joseph said softly, "is there something you haven't told us?" Lillian looked up, tears streaming down her face. I never thought, oh God, I've made such a terrible mistake." Aiden knelt beside his mother, concern etched on his face. "Mom, what is it? What mistake?" Taking a deep breath, Lillian began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Aiden, sweetie, you have a twin sister." The silence that followed was deafening. Joseph felt as if he had been struck by lightning, while Aiden stumbled back, shock written all over his face. "A sister," Aiden choked out. "How? Why didn't you tell me?" Lillian's words came out in a rush, as if a dam had broken. "When you were born, it was the hardest time of my life. I was alone, barely making ends meet. Twins, it was too much. I couldn't take care of both of you. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I gave your sister up for adoption." Joseph felt a myriad of emotions: shock, anger, heartbreak, and a strange sense of hope. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. "Ilya," Lillian replied, her voice cracking. "Her name is Ilya." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Joseph mobilized every resource at his disposal to track down Ilya. Private investigators, adoption agencies, and even government contacts were all put to work. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they had a lead. Ilya had been adopted by a family in Spain. With trembling hands, Joseph dialed the international number. A woman's voice answered in accented English. "Hello." "Hello, is this Mrs. White?" Joseph asked, his heart racing. "Yes, this is she. Who is calling?" Joseph took a deep breath. "Mrs. White, my name is Joseph Millbrook. I believe I'm Ilya's biological father." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Mrs. White spoke again, her voice was guarded. "How did you find us? What do you want?" Joseph quickly explained the situation, the recent discovery of Aiden, the medical condition, and the urgent need to contact Ilya. Mrs. White's tone softened as she listened. "Mr. Millbrook, I understand your concern, but Ilya, she's very ill. She's been diagnosed with a rare heart condition. We're at the hospital now, trying to find treatment options." Joseph felt his world tilt on its axis. Both his children suffering from the same condition oceans apart. "Miss White," he said urgently, "we need to bring Ilya here. The condition she has, we have specialists here who can treat it. Please let us help." "Etolsi and Kinberdenes help," Adaim Jont Nang whispered. There was another pause, this one filled with the weight of a monumental decision. Finally, Mrs. White spoke, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "All right, Mr. Millbrook. For Ilya's sake, we'll come." As Joseph hung up the phone, he turned to face Lillian and Aiden, who had been listening intently. "They're coming," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Ilya's coming home." The three of them embraced, a tangle of tears and tentative hope. They had found Ilya, but the battle for her health and Aiden's was just beginning. As they stood there, holding each other, Joseph silently vowed to do whatever it took to save his children, no matter the cost to himself. The following days were a blur of activity as Joseph spared no expense in arranging for Ilya's transfer to the United States. But a private medical jet was prepared, equipped with state-of-the-art technology to ensure her safe journey. Meanwhile, Aiden's condition was closely monitored, with frequent checkups and tests. As the day of Ilya's arrival drew near, tension filled the air in Joseph's mansion. Aiden paced nervously, alternating between excitement at meeting his twin sister and fear for her health. Lillian sat quietly, her face a mask of guilt and worry. Joseph, for his part, was on the phone constantly, coordinating with doctors and making sure everything was perfect for Ilya's arrival. Finally, the moment arrived. A sleek black car pulled up to the mansion, and out stepped Mrs. White, supporting a frail-looking young woman who could have been Aidan's mirror image. Ilya's face was pale, her steps unsteady, but her eyes shone with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. As the group gathered in the living room, an awkward silence fell. It was Aidan who broke it, stepping forward with a tentative smile. "Hi, Ilya. I'm Aidan, your brother." Ilya's eyes widened, and a small smile tugged at her lips. "Hello, Aidan," she replied, her voice soft but warm. The ice broken, introductions were made, and soon the room was filled with the low murmur of conversation. Joseph couldn't take his eyes off Ilya, drinking in every detail of the daughter he never knew he had. However, the reunion was cut short when Ilya suddenly gasped, clutching her chest. In an instant, the room erupted into action. Joseph called for the medical team he had on standby, while Mrs. White held Ilya, whispering words of comfort. Hours later, the family gathered in the hospital waiting room, anxiety etched on every face. Dr. Chen emerged, her expression grave. "Mr. Millbrook, may I speak with you privately?" she asked. Joseph nodded, following her to a quiet corner. "How bad is it, doctor?" Dr. Chen sighed heavily. "It's worse than we initially thought. Both Aidan and Ilya's conditions are deteriorating rapidly. They both need heart transplants, and soon." Joseph felt the blood drain from his face. "How soon?" "Ideally within the next month. 2 at most," Dr. Chen replied. "The problem is, finding 2 suitable donors in that time frame is, well, it's nearly impossible." Joseph's mind raced. What about a living donor? Partial transplants? Dr. Chen shook her head. "It's risky, and we'd still need to find compatible donors. Given the rarity of their condition, the chances of finding a match are slim." As Joseph processed this information, a thought occurred to him. What about me? Could I be a donor? Dr. Chen's eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Millbrook, you're not in good health yourself. The risks to you would be enormous. There's a very real chance you wouldn't survive the surgery." Joseph nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. "But I could save them, both of them?" "Theoretically, yes," Dr. Chen admitted reluctantly. "We could use your heart for one and split your liver between them. But Mr. Millbrook, I cannot in good conscience recommend this. The risk to your life is too great." Joseph thanked the doctor and returned to the waiting room, his mind made up. As he approached his family, he could see the question in their eyes. "Joseph, what did the doctor say?" Lillian asked, her voice trembling. Taking a deep breath, Joseph explained the situation. As he finished, he looked each of them in the eye. "I've decided to be the donor, for both of them." The room erupted into chaos. Lillian and Mrs. White protested vehemently, while Aidan and Ilya sat in shocked silence. "You can't do this," Lillian cried. "We've only just found you. You can't leave us now." Aidan stood up, his face pale but determined. "Dad, no, we'll find another way. You can't sacrifice yourself for us." Joseph held up his hand, silencing the room. "Listen to me, all of you. This is my decision. I've lived my life. I've made my fortune. But none of that means anything compared to the 2 of you," he said, looking at Aidan and Ilya. "This is my chance to do something truly meaningful, to give you both a future." Ilya, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "But Mr. Millbrook, father, we barely know you. How can you do this for us?" Joseph knelt in front of Ilya, taking her hands in his. "Because you're my children, both of you. I may not have been there for you growing up, but I'm here now. And if I can give you a chance at life, at a future, then that's what I'll do." The room fell silent, the weight of Joseph's words hanging in the air. It was Mrs. White who broke the silence, a voice thick with emotion. "Mr. Millbrook, I've only just met you, but what you're offering, it's beyond anything I could have imagined. Thank you doesn't seem adequate." As the reality of the situation sank in, new ethical dilemmas arose. Aidan, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, voiced the question they were all thinking. But who gets the heart? And who gets the liver? The room fell silent once again, the impossibility of the choice hanging heavy in the air. How could they decide whose need was greater, whose life was more valuable? Dr. Chen, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. "If I may, there might be a way to make this decision medically. We could run tests to see which organ would be most compatible with each patient. It wouldn't be a perfect solution, but it would be based on medical necessity rather than an impossible personal choice." Joseph nodded, grateful for the doctor's intervention. "That sounds like the best way forward. Who'll let the medical facts guide us?" As the family grappled with the enormity of Joseph's vision and the ethical implications it raised, a new complication arose. The hospital's ethics committee, upon learning of the proposed procedure, called an emergency meeting. The family found themselves in a sterile conference room, facing a panel of stern-faced doctors and ethicists. The head of the committee, Dr. Patel, addressed them. "Mr. Millbrook, while we understand your desire to help your children, we have serious concerns about this procedure. The risk to your life is extreme, and there are ethical considerations about using a living donor for 2 recipients, especially given your health condition." Joseph leaned forward, his voice firm. "With all due respect, Dr. Patel, this is my decision. I'm of sound mind, and I'm fully aware of the risks." Dr. Patel nodded. "We understand that, Mr. Millbrook, but we have a duty to consider all aspects of this situation. There's also the question of fairness. By doing this, you're essentially allowing your children to bypass the transplant waiting list. There are other patients who have been waiting far longer for organs." This statement caused an uproar in the room. Lillian stood up, her eyes flashing with anger. "Are you saying my children don't deserve to live because someone else has been waiting longer?" Dr. Patel held up his hands placatingly. "That's not what I'm saying at all, Mrs. Evans. We're simply pointing out the ethical complexities of this situation. Our job is to consider all perspectives." As the debate raged on, Joseph found himself torn. On one hand, he understood the committee's concerns. The idea that his actions might deprive another deserving patient of a chance at life weighed heavily on him. On the other hand, the thought of losing either Aidan or Ilya was unbearable. Finally, Joseph stood up, silencing the room. "I understand your concerns," he began, his voice steady, "and I respect the difficult position you're in. But I also know that as a father, I have a responsibility to my children. I've spent my life accumulating wealth and power, often at the expense of others. Now I have a chance to use what I have, my own body, to save 2 young lives. 2 lives that have the potential to do immense good in this world." He paused, looking each committee member in the eye. "I propose a compromise. In addition to donating my organs to Aidan and Ilya, I will set up a foundation. This foundation will fund research into their rare condition and provide support for other families facing similar situations. It won't solve the ethical dilemma entirely, but it's a step towards balancing the scales." The committee members exchanged glances, considering Joseph's words. After a moment, Dr. Patel spoke. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Millbrook. We'll need to discuss this further, but I believe we may be able to find a way forward." As the meeting adjourned, Joseph felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. The path ahead was still uncertain, fraught with medical and ethical challenges. But as he looked at Aidan and Ilya, he knew that whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, he would do everything in his power to give them a chance at life. The family left the conference room, drawn closer by the ordeal they had just faced. As they walked down the hospital corridor, Joseph realized that his search for an heir had led him to something far more valuable, a chance to leave a legacy of love, sacrifice, and hope. The day of the surgery dawned with a sense of foreboding. Joseph, Aidan, and Ilya were prepped in separate rooms, each surrounded by a team of specialists. Lillian and Mrs. White alternated between the rooms, offering words of encouragement and trying to mask their own fear. Joseph lay on the gurney, his mind surprisingly calm. He had made his peace with this decision, knowing that regardless of the outcome, he was doing everything he could for his children. As the anesthesiologist approached, he asked for a moment to speak with Lillian. "Lillian," he said, taking her hand, "I know we've had our differences, but I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've done. You raised an incredible son. Susie, we're all able son. Diabeto. acclaimed. Lillian's eyes brimmed with tears. "Joseph, I'm sorry for keeping them from you. I hope you can forgive me." Joseph squeezed her hand. "There's nothing to forgive. Just promise me you'll take care of them, no matter what happens." As Joseph was wheeled into the operating room, the gravity of the situation hit him. This could be the last time he ever saw his family. With a deep breath, he closed his eyes, ready to face whatever came next. The surgery was a complex, hours-long procedure. Teams of surgeons worked in tandem, carefully extracting Joseph's heart and liver, then preparing them for transplantation. In adjacent operating rooms, Aidan and Ilya were prepped to receive their father's life-saving organs. Sucking. In the waiting room, Lillian and Mrs. White clung to each other, united in their worry and hope. Hours ticked by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Occasionally, a nurse would come with an update, but the news was always the same: the surgery is proceeding as planned. Finally, after what seemed like days, Dr. Chen emerged, her surgical cap still on and exhaustion evident in her eyes. Lillian and Mrs. White stood up, hearts pounding. The surgeries were successful, Dr. Chen began, a small smile breaking through her professional demeanor. Aidan and Ilya are in recovery. Their new organs are functioning well, though the next 48 hours will be critical. A wave of relief washed over the room, but it was short-lived. "And Joseph?" Lillian asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Chen's expression grew somber. "Mr. Millbrook's condition is critical. We're doing everything we can, but you should prepare yourselves." The strain on his body was immense. In the next few days were a roller coaster of emotions. Aidan and Ilya showed remarkable progress, their bodies accepting the new organs with minimal complications. They were moved to a shared room, their beds side by side, allowing them to truly bond as twins for the first time. Joseph, however, remained in intensive care, his condition fluctuating wildly. There were moments of hope when his vitals would improve, followed by crushing setbacks. Lillian and Mrs. White took turns sitting with him, talking to him, urging him to keep fighting. On the 5th day post-surgery, Aidan and Ilya were deemed strong enough to visit their father. Wheeled into the ICU in wheelchairs, they were shocked by Joseph's appearance. He lay pale and still, connected to a myriad of machines that beeped and hummed, keeping him alive. Aidan reached out, gently taking his father's hand. "Dad," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "you need to wake up. We have so much to talk about, so much to do together." Ilya, on the other side of the bed, echoed her brother's sentiments. "Please, father, we've only just found you. Don't leave us now." As if responding to his children's pleas, Joseph's fingers twitched. His eyelids fluttered, and slowly, painfully, he opened his eyes. "Aidan, Ilya," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the machines. A weak smile played on his lips as he looked at his children, alive and healing. The room erupted in a flurry of activity as nurses and doctors rushed in, alerted by the change in Joseph's vitals. Dr. Chen quickly examined him, her face a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. "It's remarkable," she said, turning to the family. "He's stabilizing. I can't explain it, but it seems your presence has had a positive effect on him." Over the next few weeks, Joseph's recovery, while slow, was steady. Aidan and Ilya visited him daily, their own strength growing as they watched their father fight his way back to health. They shared stories, laughed over old photos Lillian had brought, and began to build the family bonds they had been denied for so long. As Joseph grew stronger, he also had to face the consequences of his decision. His body, weakened by the surgery and years of poor health, would never fully recover. Simple tasks now exhausted him, and he knew his life would be forever changed. But as he watched Aidan and Ilya flourish, he felt no regret. One afternoon, as the twins were animatedly discussing their plans for college, dreams that had seemed impossible just weeks ago, Joseph caught Lillian's eye. They shared a silent moment of understanding, both recognizing the miracle they were witnessing. Mrs. White, who had been a constant presence throughout the ordeal, approached Joseph's bed. "Mr. Millbrook," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done." You've given Ilya and Aidan a future. I'd like for you to be a part of that future, if you're willing." Joseph reached out, clasping Mrs. White's hand. "I'd like that very much," he said warmly. "And please call me Joseph." As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the unconventional family unit grew stronger. Joseph's mansion became a home filled with laughter, love, and the occasional heated debate as they all learned to navigate their new relationships. Joseph, watching his children thrive, felt a sense of peace he had never known before. His search for an heir had led him to something far more precious: a family, a legacy of love, and a second chance at life. As he looked around at the faces of those he loved, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by the sacrifices they had made and the love they had found. As Aidan and Aya continued to recover, the initial euphoria of their reunion began to give way to the complex realities of their situation. Joseph, though still weak, was determined to make up for lost time with his children. This determination, however, soon led to tension within the family. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Joseph broached a subject that had been on his mind. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice careful but firm, "about Ilya's living arrangements once she's fully recovered." Mrs. White tensed visibly, a fork pausing midway to her mouth. Ilya looked between her adoptive mother and her biological father, a frown creasing her brow. Joseph continued, "I've missed out on so much of your lives. I want to be there for both of you now. Ilya, I was hoping you might consider moving in here with Aidan and me." In the silence that followed was deafening. Lillian was the first to break it, her voice sharp. "Joseph, you can't be serious. Ilya has a life, a family in Spain." "I am her family," Joseph retorted, an edge creeping into his tone. "I'm her father." Miss White stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "And I'm her mother," she said, her accent thickening with emotion. "I've raised her for 23 years. You can't just swoop in and take her away." Ilya, overwhelmed by the sudden conflict, pushed away from the table. "I need some air," she mumbled, rushing out of the room with Aidan close behind her. In the garden, Ilya paced back and forth, her brother watching her with concern. "I don't know what to do, Aidan," she said, running her hands through her hair. "I love Miss White, Mum. She's the only mother I've ever known. But Joseph, he's our father. He saved our lives." Aidan nodded, understanding his sister's dilemma. "It's not an easy decision. But Ilya, you don't have to choose. We can find a way to make this work, to have both of them in our lives." Inside, the argument had escalated. Joseph, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and exertion, was on his feet. "I have rights," he insisted. "I'm her biological father. I should have a say in her life." "Rights?" Mrs. White scoffed. "Where were these rights when she was growing up, when she was sick and scared, and I was the one holding her hand?" Lillian intervened, trying to be the voice of reason. "Please, both of you calm down. This isn't helping anyone, least of all Ilya." But Joseph was too worked up to listen. "I'll take this to court if I have to," he threatened. "I have the resources, the best lawyers." "Stop it." Ilya's voice cut through the argument. She stood in the doorway, Aidan beside her, both looking pale and distressed. "Just stop it, all of you. I'm not a child and I'm not a prize to be fought over. This is my decision to make." The room fell silent, all eyes on Ilya. She took a deep breath before continuing. "I love you, Mom," she said, looking at Mrs. White, "and I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. And Joseph, Dad, I'm thankful for what you've sacrificed for us. But I can't choose between you. I won't." Aidan stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on his sister's shoulder. "Ilya's right. We're a family now, all of us. We need to find a way to make this work together." The tension in the room slowly dissipated, replaced by a sense of shame. Joseph sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I want to be part of your life, Ilya. You list so much." Mrs. White's expression softened. "I understand that, Joseph, but Ilya is an adult. We need to respect her decisions." As the family began to discuss compromise and arrangements that could work for everyone, a knock at the door interrupted them. Lillian went to answer it, returning moments later with a grave expression. "Joseph," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's someone here to see you," he says. He says he's your brother." The room fell silent once again as a man entered. He was older than Joseph, with the same sharp features and piercing eyes. But where Joseph's face had softened with recent events, this man's remained hard and unyielding. "Hello, little brother," the man said, his voice cold. "It's been a long time." Joseph stared at the newcomer, shock evident on his face. "Richard, what are you doing here?" Richard's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard about your little family reunion. And about your grand gesture of sacrifice. I must say I'm hurt you didn't think to reach out to your own brother." The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Aidan and Ilya exchanged confused glances, while Lillian and Miss White watched the interaction warily. Joseph stood up slowly, his weakness forgotten in the face of this new development. "I didn't think you'd care, Richard. You made it clear years ago that you wanted nothing to do with me or the family business." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Ah, yes, the family business, the one you've been so generously planning to leave to your newfound heirs. Did you tell them, Joseph? Did you tell them where our fortune really came from?" A look of panic flashed across Joseph's face. "Richard, don't." But Richard pressed on, his voice dripping with malice. "Our grandfather, kids, was not the noble businessman your father might have you believe. He made his fortune collaborating with dictators, profiting from the suffering of others. And your father, he always knew, but he was too weak to do anything about it." The room erupted into chaos. Aidan and Ilya looked at Joseph in disbelief, while Lillian and Mrs. White tried to make sense of the revelation. Joseph, his face ashen, slumped back into his chair. "Is it true?" Aidan demanded, his voice shaking. "Dad, is what he's saying true?" Joseph looked at his children, his eyes filled with pain and regret. I didn't know at first. But when I found out, I tried to make it right. That's why I've given so much to charity. Why I wanted to find a worthy heir. Well, I wanted to cleanse our family's legacy." Leah shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "But you kept the money. You lived off it, benefited Beef." "I'm not proud of it," Joseph admitted, "but I thought I could do more good with the resources than without them." Richard laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Always the pragmatist, aren't you, Joseph? Always finding a way to justify your actions." As the family grappled with this shocking revelation, the atmosphere in the room grew thick with tension and unspoken accusations. The carefully reconstructed bonds of trust began to fray under the weight of this hidden history. Aidan, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, turned to his father. "All this time you've been preaching about doing the right thing, about leaving a positive legacy. Was it all just to ease your conscience?" Joseph reached out to his son, but Aidan stepped back. "Aidan, please. I know I've made mistakes, but everything I've done since finding you and Ilya has been genuine. I want to make things right." Leah, tears now flowing freely, looked between Joseph and Richard. "How can we trust anything you say now? How do we know what's real and what's just another lie?" Mrs. White moved to comfort Ilya, shooting a reproachful look at both Joseph and Richard. "This is too much. These children have been through enough without you two dredging up old family sins." Lillian, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "I think we all need to take a step back and process this. Richard, I think it's best if you leave. We can discuss this as a family when everyone's had a chance to calm down." Richard smirked, seemingly satisfied with the chaos he had caused. "By all means, have your family discussion. But remember, Joseph, you can't outrun the past forever. Sooner or later, it always catches up with you." And as Richard left, the family was left to grapple with the aftermath of his revelations. The unity they had found in the wake of the surgeries now seemed fragile and uncertain. Joseph, looking around at the hurt and confused faces of his loved ones, realized that his journey was far from over. He had saved his children's lives, but now he faced an even greater challenge, saving his family from the sins of the past, and finding a way to build a future based on truth and genuine redemption. In the days following Richard's revelation, a heavy silence settled over the mansion. Odin and Ilya retreated into themselves, spending long hours in the library, poring over old newspapers and financial records, trying to piece together the true extent of their family's dark legacy. Joseph, racked with guilt and shame, found himself isolated, even Lillian keeping her distance as she struggled to reconcile this new information with the man she thought she knew. It was Mrs. White who finally broke the impasse. One morning she gathered everyone in the living room, her face set with determination. "This can't go on," she said firmly. "We're a family, for better or worse. It's time we talked about this." Joseph, looking older and more haggard than ever, nodded slowly. "You're right. I owe you all an explanation." As the family settled in, Joseph began to recount the story of his grandfather, a man who had fled post-war Europe with nothing but ambition and a willingness to do whatever it took to succeed. He spoke of backroom deals with corrupt officials, of turning a blind eye to human rights abuses in the pursuit of profit. "When I discovered the truth," Joseph said, his voice heavy with regret, "I was already deeply entrenched in the business. I told myself I could do more good from the inside, that I could slowly steer the company in a better direction." Aidan, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, interrupted. "But why keep it a secret? Why not come clean, make amends publicly?" Joseph sighed. Fear, partly. Fear of losing everything, of tarnishing the family name, but also a misguided belief that I could make things right without anyone knowing the wrong. Ilya, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "The foundation you mentioned to the ethics committee, was that part of your attempt to make amends?" Joseph nodded. "Yes, but it wasn't enough. I see that now." As the conversation continued, the complexity of the situation became clear. The family's wealth, tainted as it was, had also done considerable good, funding hospitals, schools, and numerous charitable initiatives. Lillian, who had been listening intently, finally joined the discussion. "The question now is, what do we do moving forward? How do we make this right?" The room fell silent as everyone pondered this question. It was Aidan who finally broke the silence, his voice firm with newfound resolve. "We come clean," he said. "All of it. We make a public statement, detailing everything, the good and the bad. Then we use our resources to make reparations to the communities our family has harmed." Ilya nodded in agreement. "And we use our story to advocate for corporate responsibility and ethical business practices. We can turn this dark legacy into a force for positive change." Joseph looked at his children with a mixture of pride and amazement. "You'd be willing to do that? To potentially give up everything?" "It's not giving up," Ilya replied. "It's taking responsibility. Isn't that what you taught us about being a family?" Mrs. White reached out and squeezed Ilya's hand. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Both of you," she added, smiling at Aidan. As the family began to formulate their plan, a new sense of purpose filled the room. They knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be legal challenges, public scrutiny, and potential financial ruin. But there was also a sense of liberation, of finally confronting the shadows that had haunted their family for generations. Over the next few weeks, the mansion became a hive of activity. Lawyers were consulted, statements drafted, and plans made for a press conference that would shake the business world to its core. Joseph, with Aidan and Ilya by his side, prepared to face the public and take responsibility for his family's past. The day of the press conference arrived, bringing with it a media frenzy. As Joseph stepped up to the podium, flanked by his children, he felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in years, he was acting with complete honesty and integrity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "I stand before you today to confess to a legacy of wrongdoing that spans generations." As Joseph spoke, detailing the family's misdeeds and their plans for reparation, a weight seemed to lift from his shoulders, and he saw the shock on the reporters' faces turn to a grudging respect as he outlined the extensive measures they would take to make amends. When the questions began, they were predictably harsh. Reporters demanded to know why it had taken so long, how they could trust the family's sincerity, what would happen to the thousands of employees who depended on the company. Aidan and Ilya stepped forward, fielding questions with a poise that belied their age. They spoke of their commitment to ethical business practices, of their plans to work with affected communities, of their determination to transform their family legacy from one of exploitation to one of responsibility and positive change. As the press conference wound down, Joseph felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Richard standing there, a complex of emotions playing across his face. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," Richard said, his voice gruff. "I don't know what I thought." Joseph regarded his brother carefully. "It was time, Richard. We can't change the past, but we can shape the future." Richard nodded slowly. Maybe there's a place for me in that future too, if you'll have me." As the brothers shook hands, tentatively beginning to bridge the chasm between them, Joseph realized that this confession had done more than clear his conscience. It had opened the door to healing wounds he hadn't even known existed. The family left the press conference knowing that the hardest part of their journey was still ahead. There would be investigations, lawsuits, and a long, difficult process of making amends. But as they faced the flashing cameras and shouted questions together, there was also a sense of hope. They had taken the first step towards redemption, not just for themselves, but for generations past and future. In confronting their darkest secrets, they had found a new strength, a new purpose. And in doing so, they had redefined what it meant to be a family, not just bound by blood or circumstance, but by a shared commitment to doing what was right, no matter the cost. In the months following the press conference, the Millbrook family found themselves navigating a storm of legal battles, public scrutiny, and financial upheaval. The company's stock plummeted, long-standing business partners distanced themselves, and the media circus showed no signs of abating. Yet, amidst the chaos, the family stood united, their bonds strengthened by the shared commitment to making amends for their past. However, just as they were beginning to find their footing in this new reality, fate dealt them another blow. Aidan, who had been experiencing increased fatigue and shortness of breath, collapsed during a meeting with the foundation they had established for reparations. The family rushed to the hospital, fear gripping their hearts as they waited for news. Dr. Chen emerged from the emergency room, her face grave. "But I'm afraid Aidan's body is showing signs of rejecting the transplanted heart," she explained. "But we've started him on anti-rejection medications. But given the unique nature of his condition, we're not seeing the response we'd hoped for." Ilya, who had been holding up well under the stress of recent events, felt her knees buckle. Joseph caught her, his own face ashen with worry. "What are our options?" Dr. Lillian asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Shen hesitated before responding. "There is an experimental treatment. It's a new form of gene therapy combined with stem cell treatment. In theory, it could help Aidan's body accept the transplant and even strengthen his overall health." But she paused, her expression serious. "It's highly experimental. The risks are significant, and there's no guarantee of success." The family exchanged worried glances. They had already been through so much, and the thought of putting Aidan through another risky procedure was daunting. "What kind of risks are we talking about?" Joseph asked, his voice hoarse. "The treatment could trigger a severe autoimmune response," Dr. Chen explained. "In the worst-case scenario, it could accelerate the rejection process or cause multi-organ failure. On the other hand, if it works, it could not only save Aidan's life, but potentially cure his condition entirely." As the family grappled with this information, a new complication arose. Dr. Chen received a call and excused herself, returning a few minutes later with a troubled expression. "There's been a development," she said. "The research team has informed me that they only have enough of the experimental treatment for one patient. And Ilya's latest tests show that she's also starting to exhibit early signs of rejection." The room fell silent as the implications of this news sank in. They were faced with an impossible choice: which of the twins should receive the potentially life-saving treatment. Joseph felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. How could he possibly choose between his children? Lillian and Mrs. White both looked shell-shocked, unable to process this cruel twist of fate. Ilya, however, spoke up immediately. "Give it to Aiden," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "He's worse off than me. He needs it more." No, Aiden's weak voice came from the hospital bed. He had regained consciousness and heard the tail end of the conversation. "Elia should have it. I've had more time with the family. It's her turn." The twins locked eyes, a lifetime of unspoken connection passing between them in that moment. Joseph watched his children, overwhelmed by their selflessness and love for each other. "There has to be another way," Mrs. White said, her voice cracking. "Can't we split the treatment between them?" Dr. Chen shook her head. "I'm afraid that wouldn't be effective. The treatment needs to be administered in full to have any chance of success." As the family debated, each suggesting that the other twin should receive the treatment, Joseph found his mind racing. There had to be a solution, some way to save both his children. Suddenly, an idea struck him. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice urgent, "this experimental treatment, could it work on someone who hasn't had a transplant? Someone with the same genetic condition?" Dr. Chen looked thoughtful. "In theory, yes. The treatment is designed to correct the genetic mutation that causes the condition. Why do you ask?" Joseph took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to propose. "What if I underwent the treatment? I have the same genetic condition. If it works on me, could you then use my cells to treat both Aiden and Ilya?" The room erupted in protest. Lillian grabbed Joseph's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Joseph, no, you're still recovering from the transplant surgery. Your body couldn't handle this kind of stress." Dr. Chen looked conflicted. "Mr. Millbrook, while your idea is scientifically sound, the risks to you would be enormous. Given your weakened state, there's a very high chance you wouldn't survive the treatment." Joseph looked around at his family, at Aiden and Ilya, both willing to sacrifice themselves for the other, at Lillian and Mrs. White, their faces etched with worry and love, even at Richard, who had been quietly supportive in the background. "I understand the risks," Joseph said quietly. "But if there's even a chance it could save both of them, I have to try. I've lived my life. They're just starting theirs." Dane and Ilya both began to protest, but Joseph held up his hand. "This is my decision," he said firmly. "I've made mistakes in my life, so many mistakes. But loving you, being your father, that's the best thing I've ever done. Let me do this for you." The room fell silent, the weight of Joseph's words hanging in the air. Dr. Chen, recognizing the gravity of the moment, quietly excused herself to give the family time to process. As the family grappled with Joseph's decision, each coming to terms with the potential consequences, a new sense of unity emerged. Rogue party. They had faced public scandal, financial ruin, and now this medical crisis together. Whatever the outcome, they would face it as one. Joseph turned to Dr. Chen, his resolve firm. "Let's do it," he said. As the medical team began to prepare for the risky procedure, Joseph found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. From a lonely millionaire searching for an heir to a father willing to risk everything for his children, he had been transformed by love and the power of family. As he was wheeled into the treatment room, Joseph felt a sense of peace wash over him. In whatever happened, he knew that his legacy would live on through Aiden and Ilya, not a legacy of wealth or power, but one of love, sacrifice, and the courage to do what's right. The door to the treatment room closed, and the family was left to wait, hope, and pray for a miracle that could save them all. As Joseph underwent the experimental treatment, the outside world continued to churn. The Millbrook Company, once a titan of industry, was now in turmoil. The board of directors, alarmed by the plummeting stock prices and exodus of business partners, called an emergency meeting. In Joseph's absence, Aiden and Ilya, despite their weakened conditions, decided to attend via video conference. They were determined to uphold their father's vision of transparency and ethical business practices, no matter the cost. The boardroom was tense, filled with anxious executives and stern-faced lawyers. As soon as the twins' faces appeared on the large screen, the CEO, a long-time associate of Joseph's named Robert Hawthorne, began his attack. This confession was reckless and unnecessary, Hawthorne declared, his voice sharp with anger. Decades of hard work and success, thrown away on a misguided attempt at redemption. We're hemorrhaging money and clients. Something needs to be done. Aidan, his face pale but determined, spoke up. Our father made the right decision. We can't build a future on a foundation of lies and exploitation. Elia nodded in agreement. We understand the financial implications, but there are more important things than money. We have a responsibility to make amends for the harm our family has caused. Hawthorne scoffed. Responsibility? Your responsibility is to the thousands of employees who depend on this company for their livelihoods, to the shareholders who trusted us with their investments. As the argument escalated, a junior executive named Sarah Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, hesitantly raised her hand. If I may, she began, her voice quiet but steady, I think there might be a way to turn this situation to our advantage. All eyes turned to her, some curious, others skeptical. Sarah continued, gaining confidence. What if we position ourselves as leaders in corporate responsibility? We could use our story as a catalyst for change in the business world. It's a risk, yes, but it could also be an opportunity to redefine our brand and attract a new generation of socially conscious investors and customers. The room erupted into heated debate. Some board members rallied behind Sarah's idea, seeing it as a bold move that could salvage their reputation. Others, led by Hawthorne, argued that it was naive and would only accelerate their downfall. As the twins listened to the back and forth, they felt the weight of their father's legacy on their shoulders. They knew that the decisions made in this room would shape not only the future of the company, but also the impact of their family's attempt at redemption. Aidan, summoning his strength, spoke up. Miss Chen is right. This is our chance to lead by example. We can show the world that it's possible to be both profitable and ethical. Ilya added, we're not just fighting for our company. We're fighting for a new way of doing business, one that values people and the planet as much as profits. Their words seemed to resonate with some board members, but Hawthorne was not swayed. This is absurd, he spat. If you insist on this course of action, I'll have no choice but to tender my resignation. A tense silence fell over the room. Hawthorne had been with the company for decades, and his departure would be a significant blow. The twins exchanged a glance, silently communicating as only they could. Finally, Aidan spoke, his voice soft but firm. We appreciate your years of service, Mr. Hawthorne, but if you can't support this new direction, then perhaps it is best that you step down. Hawthorne's face reddened with anger. You'll regret this, he warned as he stormed out of the boardroom. In the aftermath of Hawthorne's departure, the board tentatively agreed to explore Sarah's proposal. As the meeting adjourned, the twins felt a mixture of exhaustion and cautious hope. Back at the hospital, Lillian and Mrs. White had been anxiously waiting for news about Joseph's treatment. When Dr. Chen finally emerged from the treatment room, her expression was unreadable. The treatment is complete, she said. Now we wait. The next 48 hours will be critical. As the family settled in for the long vigil, Aidan and Ilya filled them in on what had transpired at the board meeting. Lillian listened with a mixture of pride and concern. Your father would be proud of you both, she said, squeezing their hands. But remember, you need to take care of yourselves too. You can't fight all these battles if you're not well. Mrs. White nodded in agreement. Lillian's right. You two need to rest. Let us handle things for a while. But even as they agreed to rest, Aidan and Ilya couldn't shake the weight of responsibility they felt. They had set in motion a chain of events that would have far-reaching consequences, not just for their family and company, but potentially for the entire business world. As night fell, the hospital room was quiet save for the steady beep of Joseph's heart monitor. Aidan and Ilya, unable to sleep, found themselves reflecting on the whirlwind of events that had brought them to this point. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Ilya whispered, voicing the doubt that had been nagging at her. Aidan was silent for a moment before responding. I don't know if it's the right thing, but I think it's the necessary thing. We can't change the past, but we can try to shape the future. As they talked, they realized that their journey was far from over. They had faced public scandal, corporate upheaval, and life-threatening illness. But the real challenge lay ahead, living up to the ideals they had espoused and transforming their family legacy from one of exploitation to one of positive change. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with obstacles and hard choices, but as they looked at their father fighting for his life to give them a chance at theirs, they knew they had to try. But whatever came next, they would face it together, as a family. As dawn broke, casting a soft light through the hospital room window, Joseph stirred. His eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on the anxious faces gathered around his bed. Aidan and Ilya, their own health concerns momentarily forgotten, leaned in eagerly. "Dad," Aidan's voice was barely above a whisper, hope and fear intermingling in that single word. Joseph managed a weak smile. "Hey kids," he rasped, his voice hoarse but clear. "Looks like I made it." The room erupted in a mixture of tears and laughter. Dr. Chen, who had been monitoring Joseph closely, stepped forward to check his vitals. "It's remarkable," she said, her voice filled with professional awe. "The treatment seems to be working. Your body is showing signs of cellular regeneration that I've never seen before." As the initial excitement settled, the gravity of their situation began to sink in. Joseph's recovery was just the first step. They still had to see if his cells could be used to treat Aidan and Ilya. Over the next few days, as Joseph regained his strength, the family found themselves drawn closer together. The shared crisis had a way of putting their past conflicts into perspective. Even Richard, who had been keeping his distance, became a more frequent visitor. One evening, as the family sat together in Joseph's hospital room, Richard cleared his throat awkwardly. "I owe you all an apology," he began, his usual bravado absent. "I thought exposing our family's past would bring me some sort of satisfaction. But seeing how you've all handled it, the courage you've shown, I was wrong." Joseph reached out, clasping his brother's hand. "We've all made mistakes, Richard. What matters is what we do now." As the brothers reconciled, Aidan and Ilya exchanged glances. They had been discussing something in private, and now seemed like the right time to bring it up. "We've been thinking," Ilya began, "about the company and our family's legacy." Aidan nodded, continuing where his sister left off. "We want to transform the company into something new, not just ethical business practices, but a complete shift in focus." Joseph raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What did you have in mind?" "We want to turn the company's resources towards medical research and accessible healthcare," Ilya explained, "starting with rare genetic conditions like ours." "The technology that saved you, Dad," Aidan added, "it could help so many people. But it needs more research, more funding." Joseph listened, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. His children had taken the darkest parts of their family history and were transforming it into something truly meaningful. Lillian, who had been quietly supportive throughout, spoke up. "It's a beautiful idea. But you know it won't be easy. There will be resistance, both from within the company and from competitors." Mrs. White nodded in agreement. "The pharmaceutical industry is cutthroat. They won't take kindly to a new player disrupting the market with affordable treatments." "We know," Ilya said, her voice filled with determination, "but we think it's worth fighting for." As the family discussed the challenges and possibilities of this new direction, Dr. Chen entered the room, her face serious. "I have news," she said, drawing everyone's attention. "We've analyzed Joseph's cells, and they show incredible potential. We believe we can use them to create treatments for both Aidan and Ilya." A wave of relief washed over the room, but Dr. Chen wasn't finished. "However, there's a complication. A rival pharmaceutical company has caught wind of our research. They're claiming that the treatment Joseph received was based on proprietary technology they own. They're threatening legal action if we proceed with using it to treat Aidan and Ilya." The news hit the family like a bucket of cold water. Just when they thought they had overcome their biggest hurdle, a new challenge presented itself. "That's ridiculous," Richard exclaimed, his old fire returning. "They can't own the rights to someone's cells." Dr. Chen sighed. "It's more complicated than that. The treatment involved proprietary gene editing techniques. They're arguing that any cells modified by their technology fall under their patent." Joseph sat up straighter in his bed, his mind already working on a solution. What if we offered to collaborate with them, share the research and potential profits in exchange for allowing us to use the treatment? Aidan shook his head. But Dad, if we do that, we'd be right back where we started, profiting from technology that should be helping people, not lining shareholders' pockets. The room fell silent as they grappled with the dilemma. It was Ilya who finally broke the silence, her voice quiet but determined. What if we went public with everything, she suggested. Not just our family history, but this situation too. Show the world how patent laws and corporate greed are standing in the way of life-saving treatments. Lillian looked concerned. That's a big risk. It could backfire, turn public opinion against us. Or, Mrs. White countered, it could rally support. People are tired of big pharma putting profits over patients. As they debated the pros and cons of each approach, Joseph watched his family with a mixture of pride and amazement. They had come so far, faced so much, and yet here they were, still fighting not just for themselves, but for something bigger. I think Ilya's right, Joseph said finally, his voice cutting through the discussion. We started this journey with a commitment to honesty and transparency. We can't back down now, not when it matters most. The family looked at each other, a silent agreement passing between them. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles and public scrutiny, but they also knew they had something powerful on their side, the truth and each other. Over the next few weeks, as Aidan and Ilya began their treatments, the Millbrook family prepared for their biggest fight yet. They hired a team of lawyers specializing in medical patent law, reached out to patient advocacy groups, and began crafting their public statement. The day before their planned press conference, the family gathered in Joseph's hospital room. Despite the seriousness of their situation, there was a sense of unity and purpose that filled the air. Whatever happens tomorrow, Joseph said, looking at each member of his family in turn, I want you all to know how proud I am of all of you. We've been through so much, made so many mistakes, but look at us now. We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for something that could change lives all over the world. Aidan and Ilya, both showing signs of improvement from their treatments, sat on either side of their father's bed. Lillian and Mrs. White stood nearby, their past rivalry forgotten in the face of their shared love for the twins. Even Richard, once the family's black sheep, stood with them, ready to lend his business acumen to their cause. As they went over their strategy one last time, a nurse entered the room. Mr. Millbrook, she said, addressing Joseph, there's a call for you. They say it's urgent. Joseph took the phone, his brow furrowing as he listened. As he hung up, he looked at his family, a mix of emotions playing across his face. That was the CEO of the pharmaceutical company, he said. They've heard about our plans to go public. They want to meet tonight. The family exchanged glances, realizing that this could change everything. As they prepared to face this final challenge, they knew that whatever the outcome, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together as a family united not by blood alone, but by shared purpose and unwavering love. The meeting with the pharmaceutical company's CEO turned out to be a turning point for the Millbrook family. After hours of intense negotiation, a compromise was reached. The company would allow the use of their technology for Aidan and Ilya's treatment in exchange for a collaboration on future research and development. The Millbrooks' plan to transform their company into a force for accessible healthcare had impressed the CEO, opening the door for a potentially groundbreaking partnership. As dawn broke over the city, the family emerged from the meeting room, exhausted but triumphant. They had won not just the right to treat Aidan and Ilya, but also a powerful ally in their mission to revolutionize the healthcare industry. Over the next few months, life for the Millbrook family settled into a new rhythm. Aidan and Ilya's treatments progressed well, their health improving steadily under Dr. Chen's careful supervision. Joseph, too, continued to recover, his body growing stronger each day thanks to the experimental treatment he had undergone. The mansion, once a symbol of the family's isolated wealth, became a hub of activity. The library was converted into a makeshift office where Joseph, Aidan, and Ilya worked on plans for the company's new direction. Lillian and Mrs. White, having formed an unlikely but strong friendship, often sat in the sunroom, poring over medical research papers and discussing ways to make treatments more accessible to those in need. Even Richard found his place in this new family dynamic. His years of cutthroat business experience, once used for personal gain, were now directed towards navigating the complex world of medical patents and pharmaceutical regulations. One sunny afternoon, as the family gathered in the garden for a rare moment of relaxation, Aidan broached a subject that had been on his mind. "I've been thinking," he began, looking around at his family, "about what we want to call our new healthcare initiative." Ilya perked up, her eyes sparkling with interest. "Oh, what did you have in mind?" Aidan smiled, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Well, I was thinking we could call it Second Chances, because that's what we're all about, isn't it? Giving people another shot at life, just like we got." The family fell silent, considering the name. It was Joseph who spoke first, his voice thick with emotion. "I think it's perfect, son. Second chances, that's exactly what we're all about." As the others nodded in agreement, Mrs. White raised her glass of lemonade. "To second chances, then. May it give hope to those who need it most." The family toasted, their glasses clinking in the warm afternoon sun. It was a moment of pure joy, unmarred by the challenges they had faced or the ones still to come. As the weeks turned into months, the effects of the Millbrooks' new venture began to ripple outward. The story of their family's transformation from corporate titans to healthcare revolutionaries captured the public's imagination. Donations poured in, and other companies began to take notice of their ethical business model. Aidan and Ilya, now fully recovered, threw themselves into the work with passion. They traveled to speak at medical conferences, met with patient advocacy groups, and worked tirelessly to make their vision of accessible healthcare a reality. Joseph, while still involved in the big decisions, found himself taking a step back, content to watch his children lead the way. He spent more time with Lillian, rekindling the connection they had lost so many years ago. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lillian turned to Joseph. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" she asked, her voice soft with wonder. Joseph shook his head, a smile playing on his lips. "Never in my wildest dreams. When I started this journey, I was just a lonely old man looking for an heir. Now look at us. A family. A purpose. It's more than I ever could have hoped for." Lillian reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We've been given a second chance too, haven't we?" Joseph nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "We certainly have, and I intend to make the most of it." Inside the house, Aidan and Ilya were engaged in a lively debate with Richard and Miss White about the next phase of their project. The sound of their voices, passionate and full of hope, drifted out to the porch. "Listen to them," Joseph said, his voice filled with pride. "They're going to change the world, Lillian. Our children are going to change the world." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the mansion and its grounds, the Millbrook family found themselves at the beginning of a new chapter. The pain of the past had not been forgotten, but it had been transformed into a driving force for good. They had faced public scandal, life-threatening illness, corporate upheaval, and their own personal demons. But through it all, they had discovered the true meaning of family, not just shared blood, but shared purpose, unconditional love, and the courage to fight for what's right. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt, but as Joseph looked around at the family he had found and rebuilt, he knew that together they could face anything. From a lonely millionaire searching for an heir, to the patriarch of a family dedicated to making a difference in the world, Joseph's transformation was complete. And as night fell over the Millbrook mansion, bringing with it the promise of a new day to come, he felt, for perhaps the first time in his life, truly rich. The story of the Millbrook family was far from over. In fact, in many ways it was just beginning. But whatever the future held, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, bound not by obligation or blood alone, but by love, shared purpose, and the unshakable belief that it's never too late for a second chance. 5 years had passed since the Millbrook family's life-altering journey began. The mansion, once a symbol of isolated wealth, now bustled with activity as the headquarters of Second Chances, the healthcare initiative that had grown beyond their wildest dreams. On a warm summer evening, the family gathered in the grand living room to celebrate the 5th anniversary of their foundation. The room was filled with not just family, but also key team members, beneficiaries of their programs, and supporters who had been instrumental in their success. Joseph, now in his early 70s but healthier than he'd been in years, stood to address the gathering. His voice, once commanding in boardrooms, now carried a gentle strength as he spoke. 5 years ago, I thought I was at the end of my journey. I was a lonely man, searching for an heir to a fortune I wasn't even sure was worth passing on. But fate had other plans. He glanced at Aidan and Ilya, who sat side by side, their faces beaming with pride and love. I found not just an heir, but 2 incredible children I never knew I had, and with them came a new purpose, a chance to right the wrongs of the past and build something truly meaningful. Joseph continued, his voice thick with emotion. We've faced challenges I never could have imagined. We've confronted our family's dark past, battled life-threatening illnesses, and taken on an entire industry set in its ways. But through it all, we discovered the true meaning of family and legacy. Lillian stepped forward, joining Joseph at the front of the room. What Joseph is too modest to say, she added with a smile, is that his courage and willingness to change set all of this in motion. He showed us that it's never too late to choose a different path. As Joseph and Lillian shared a tender look, Aidan stood up. When we started Second Chances, we had a simple goal: to make life-saving treatments accessible to those who needed them most. Today, I'm proud to say we've helped over 1 million people worldwide. Ilya joined her brother, her eyes shining. But more than that, we've started a movement. Other companies are following our lead, prioritizing ethical practices and accessibility over pure profit. We're seeing a shift in the entire healthcare industry. The room erupted in applause, but Ilya held up her hand, not finished. None of this would have been possible without every person in this room. Our family, our team, our supporters, you all took a chance on us, on this crazy idea that we could do things differently. Thank you. As the celebration continued, Joseph found himself in a quiet corner with Richard. The brothers, once estranged, now stood side by side, watching the room full of people whose lives had been touched by their family's journey. You know, Joe, Richard said, his voice gruff with emotion, I spent years resenting you, resenting our family's legacy. But watching what you've built here, I've never been prouder to be a Millbrook. Joseph clasped his brother's shoulder. We built this together, Richard. Your experience, your insights, they've been invaluable. We couldn't have done this without you. As the evening wore on, Joseph took a moment to step out onto the balcony, needing a breath of fresh air. He was soon joined by Mrs. White, who had become an integral part of their unconventional family. It's quite a view, isn't it? She said, gazing out over the city lights. Joseph nodded, a contented smile on his face. It certainly is, though I must admit, the view inside is even better. Mrs. White chuckled softly. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad Ilya found her birth family. The love and purpose you've all found together, it's truly remarkable. You're a part of that too, you know, Joseph said, turning to face her. You raised Ilya into the amazing woman she is. You'll always be her mother, just as much as Lillian is. Inside, Aidan and Ilya were sharing stories with some of the young beneficiaries of their programs. Their faces lit up as they described their own health struggles and how it had inspired them to help others. You see, Aidan was saying, our family story taught us that our biggest challenges can become our greatest strengths. Every obstacle we faced led us here, to this moment where we can make a real difference. Ilya nodded in agreement. We learned that true wealth isn't about money or power. It's about the lives you touch, the positive change you create in the world. As the night drew to a close, the family found themselves alone in the living room once more. They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this point. Joseph looked around at the faces of his loved ones. Lillian, the woman he had rediscovered and fallen in love with all over again, Aidan and Ilya, the children who had taught him the true meaning of legacy, Richard, the brother he had reconciled with, and Mrs. White, the unexpected addition who had enriched their lives in countless ways. You know, he said softly, breaking the silence, when I started this journey, I thought I was looking for someone to leave my wealth to. But what I found was so much more valuable. I found a family, a purpose, a chance to make amends for the past and build a better future. Aidan smiled, reaching out to squeeze his father's hand. And in doing so, you gave us all a second chance, not just at life, but at being a family. Ilya nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. You taught us that it's never too late to change, to do the right thing. That's a legacy worth more than any fortune. As they sat there, surrounded by the warmth of family and the knowledge of the good they had done and would continue to do, Joseph felt a sense of peace wash over him. The journey had been long and often difficult, filled with unexpected twists and painful revelations, but it had led them here, to this moment of unity and purpose. The Millbrook family had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others. They had taken a legacy tainted by past misdeeds and turned it into a force for good in the world. And in doing so, they had discovered the true meaning of wealth, not measured in dollars and cents, but in lives touched, wrongs righted, and love shared. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Joseph looked at his family and smiled. Their story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together, bound by love, united in purpose, and always ready to offer a second chance to those who needed it most. Your past does not define your future. No matter how dark your history, how deep your regrets, or how hopeless things may seem, it's never too late for redemption. And every day is a new opportunity to rewrite your story, to turn your greatest weaknesses into your most powerful strengths. Family isn't just about blood. It's about the bonds we forge through love, sacrifice, and shared purpose. Sometimes our greatest challenges can lead us to our most profound connections and our true calling in life. Wealth isn't measured by the money in your bank account, but by the lives you touch and the positive change you create in the world. Your mistakes and struggles can become the foundation for something beautiful and meaningful if you have the courage to face them and the determination to make amends. Remember, every ending is just a new beginning in disguise. It's never too late for a second chance at life, at love, at making a difference. Your legacy isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the choices you make today and every day forward. In the end, the most valuable inheritance we can leave behind isn't money or power, but the positive impact we've had on others and the world around us. So embrace your second chances, cherish your loved ones, and never stop striving to be a force for good in the world. Your greatest chapter may still be waiting to be written. As we close this chapter of the Millbrook family's incredible journey, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Did this story of redemption, second chances, and the true meaning of family resonate with you? If you found yourself moved by their struggles and triumphs, why not leave a comment with the number 1? And for those of you eager to dive deeper into the Millbrooks world, wondering what new challenges and victories await them, a 2 in the comments would let us know you're craving more. Your enthusiasm fuels our storytelling. Of course, we value all perspectives. If there were aspects of the story you disagreed with or wish had been handled differently, we encourage you to share your thoughts. Your insights help us grow and improve as storytellers. Lastly, if you've enjoyed being part of this journey and want to support our team in bringing more compelling stories to life, consider subscribing to our channel. Each subscription is a vote of confidence that inspires us to keep pushing the boundaries of storytelling. Remember, your engagement doesn't just show support, it helps shape the stories we tell. So whether it's a simple number, a thoughtful comment, or a subscription, know that your voice matters to us. Thank you for being part of our storytelling family.